The Little Bookroom by Eleanor Farjeon. The king's daughter cries for the moon. One night the king's daughter looked out of her window and wanted the moon. She stretched out her hand to take it, but couldn't reach it. So she went upstairs to the garret and stood on a chair and pushed up the skylight and got out on the roof of the palace. But still she couldn't reach it. So she climbed up the tallest chimney pot and clung to the cowl, and still she couldn't reach. Then she began to cry. A bat that was flying by stopped to ask, "King's daughter, why are you weeping?" "Because I want the moon," said she, "and I can't reach it." "Neither can I," said the bat, "and if I could, I am not powerful enough to pull it out of the sky. But I will tell the night of your desire, and it may be she will fetch down the moon for you herself." The bat flew away to tell the night, and the king's daughter continued to cling to the chimney cowl and look at the moon and cry for it. When morning came and the moon disappeared in the light, a swallow awoke in its nest under the roof, and she too asked, "King's daughter, why are you weeping?" "Because I want the moon," said she. "I prefer the sun myself," said the swallow, "but I am sorry for you, and I will tell the day, and perhaps he will be able to help you to your wish." And the swallow flew away to tell the day. The palace was now in a state of commotion, for the nurse had gone to the room of the king's daughter and found the bed empty. She rushed at once to the king's bedchamber and banged on the door, crying, "Wake up, wake up. Someone has stolen your daughter." The king got out of his bed with his nightcap awry and called through the keyhole, "Who?" "The boy who cleans the silver," said the nurse. "Only last week a plate was missing, and he who steals a plate will steal a princess." "Yes, that's who, if you ask me." "I did ask you," said the king. "Therefore, let the boy be put in prison." The nurse ran as hard as she could to the barracks and told the colonel in command that the boy who cleaned the silver was to be arrested for stealing the king's daughter. The colonel in command put on his sword and his spurs and his epaulets and his medals and gave every soldier a week's leave to go home and say goodbye to his mother. "We will make the arrest on the 1st of April," said the colonel in command. Then he shut himself up in his study and began to draw up plans of attack. The nurse went back to the palace and told the king all that was being done, and the king rubbed his hands with satisfaction. "So much for the boy," he said. "Be sure not to let him get a hint of it till the moment of his arrest arrives. And now we must see about tracing the princess." He sent for his chief detective and put the matter before him. The chief detective immediately looked very clever and said, "The first thing is to find some clues and take some thumbprints." "Whose thumbprints?" asked the king. "Everybody's," said the chief detective. "Mine too," asked the king. "Your Majesty is the first gentleman in the realm," said the chief detective. "We shall naturally begin with your Majesty's." The king looked pleased and spread out his thumbs, but before the chief detective started taking thumbprints, he sent for his full force of under-detectives and told them to search for clues all over the city. "And be sure you are all well disguised," said he. The second detective scratched his chin and said, "I'm sorry, Chief, but last spring cleaning I found that the moth had got into the disguises, so I sold them to the rag and bone man." "Then order some more at once from the disguise maker," said the chief detective, "and tell him to be quick about them." "May we choose our own disguises?" asked the second detective. "Yes, what you like, as long as they are all different," said the chief, and the detectives, of whom there were around 1,000, went home to think out their disguises, all different. But it took a lot of settling because 3 wanted to go as burglars and 5 as teddy bears. Meanwhile, the chief detective had prepared a plate of black stuff, and the king was just rubbing his thumbs on it when the cook came up and gave notice. "Why?" asked the king. "Because do what I will, the kitchen fire won't light," said the cook, "and if the kitchen fire won't light, I won't stay." "Why won't it light?" asked the king. "Water in the flue," said the cook. "It trickles down, and it trickles down, and I mop it up, and I mop it up, and it's not a bit of good. It only comes down faster. Nobody can be expected to cook without a fire, so I'm going." "When?" said the king. "Now," said the cook. "You must have your thumbprints taken first," said the king. "Does it hurt?" asked the cook. "Not at all," said the king. "It's rather fun." The cook had her thumbprints taken and went and packed her boxes. As soon as they heard that the king's cook had given notice, all the other cooks in the country gave notice too, for whatever happened in the king's home set the fashion in the dukes, and the earls, and the barons, and the mayors, and in Mr. and Mrs. John Jenkinson's. The consequence was, but there were such a lot of consequences that they can't all be told in one chapter. If you want to know what they were, you must go on to the next. The bat flew away to find the night and tell her that the king's daughter was crying for the moon. But Night was not easy to find, though her shadow was everywhere. At last, however, he found her walking in a wood, looking to see that all was well. If a flower was too wide awake, she touched its eye, and the eye closed. If a tree stirred in its sleep, she hushed it till it was quiet. If a wren cheeped in its nest, she stroked its feathers till it dreamed again. But the drowsy owl in the hollow trunk, or the moth clinging under its leaf, she wakened and sent flying. When the bat settled on her hand, she said, "Well, child, what are you come for?" "I am come to tell you that the king's daughter wants the moon." "She must want, then," said the knight. "I can't spare the moon. Go back and tell her so." "But, mother, she is crying for it." "Fie," said Night. "If we gave babies everything they cry for in the dark, mothers would get no rest at all. Tell me one good reason why I should give this one what she is crying for." The bat tried to think of a good reason, and at last said, "Because she has gray eyes, black hair, and white cheeks." "What has that to do with it, foolish one?" said Night. "Go, go, I am busy." She shook the bat off her hand and went on through the wood, and the bat hung himself upside down on a branch and sulked. Out of a hole in the tree an owl popped its head and asked, "Did you say gray eyes?" "Yes," said the bat, "as gray as twilight." Up through a crack in the ground a mouse poked its nose and asked, "Did you say black hair?" "Yes," said the bat, "as black as a shadow." And a moth peered round a leaf to ask, "Did you say white cheeks?" "Yes," said the bat, "as white as starshine." The owl then said, "She is one of us, and we must stand by her. If she wants the moon, she ought to have the moon." "Night is in the wrong." "Night is in the wrong," repeated the mouse. "And night is in the wrong," echoed the moth. A small passing wind caught the syllables and carried them round the world. Up hill and down dale it went, whispering, "Night is in the wrong." Night is in the wrong. Night is in the wrong. And all the children of the dark came out to listen, owls and foxes, nightjars and nightingales, rats and mice, bats and moths, and the cats that prowl on the tiles. When the wind had said the thing 3 times, they too began to say it. Night is in the wrong, barked the foxes. Night is in the wrong, rattled the nightjars. Have you heard the news? Squeaked a mouse to a moth. Night is in the wrong. Yes, she is in the wrong, agreed the moth. I always said as much. And the nightingales trilled the words so loud and long that they reached the ears of the stars, who all began to shout at once, Night is in the wrong. What do you say? Asked the moon from the middle of the sky. We say, and we say it again, said the evening star, that night is in the wrong. We will say it till all's blue. You are right, said the moon. I have not liked to mention it before, but nobody knows night better than I do, and without any doubt she is entirely in the wrong. Nobody stopped to ask why night was in the wrong. It was enough that everybody was saying so. Long before morning, the children of the dark had worked themselves into a state of fury against their mother and decided to rebel against her. But above all, concerted action is necessary, said the moon. It is useless for a moth to protest here and a cat to howl there. If we mean to act, we must act together. At a given moment, we must one and all refuse to support night any longer. Yes, we must act, we must strike, we must refuse to support the night, cried the bats and the cats, the moths and the owls, the stars and the nightingales, all in one breath. Hush, said the moon. She may hear you. Go on for a while as though nothing had happened, and on the 1st of April, when our plans are prepared, we will show night once and for all that she is in the wrong. A few hours after the children of the dark had come to their great decision, the swallow was on its way to tell the day that the king's daughter was crying for the moon. He found Day just stepping out of the sea, wiping his golden feet on the sand. Up with the lark, swallow, said he. How come you to be out so early? Because, said the swallow, the king's daughter is crying for the moon. Well, that's none of my business, said Day, and I can't see, child, that it is any of yours. Not my business, not my business, twittered the swallow indignantly. He tried hard to think why it should be his business, and added, Why, father, how can you say it's not my business? The king's daughter has blue eyes, gold hair, and pink cheeks. Then she has her full share and can do without the moon, said Day. What? Would you have me fall out with my sister the night in order to dry the tears of the king's daughter? Get on with your work, silly twitterer, while I get on with mine. And with a stride he stepped from the shore to the fields, gilding the grass as he went. Up through a pool in the rocks a fish pushed his nose. Blue eyes, has she? As blue as the sky, said the swallow. A daisy leaned over the cliff and asked, Gold hair? As gold as light, said the swallow. A gull hung poised in the air to ask, and pink cheeks. As pink as morning, said the swallow. The gull slid down the wind and screamed, Then she is one of us, and if she wants the moon, she must have the moon. And if Day will not help her to get the moon, down with Day. Down with Day, cried the daisy. Down with Day, gasped the fish. And a little wave that was running backward and forward on the sands heard the words, and flowed back into the sea, murmuring, "Down with day, down with day, down with day." The big waves caught it up, like the chorus of a song, and they too thundered, "Down with day," as they towered up and fell down with a crash, and soon the whole sea was heaving with the sound of the words, and the tides were streaming with it to all the shores of the earth. "Down with day," roared every tide as it swept in, and all the creatures of the 5 continents heard them, and echoed the cry in their own ways. The mockingbirds of America whistled it, the elephants of Africa trumpeted it, the hooded cobras of Asia hissed it, the laughing jackasses of Australasia shrieked it, and all the larks of Europe trilled it to the sun. "What's that you're singing?" the sun asked the larks, who were his particular pets. "Down with day, down with day. We are singing down with day." "By all means," said the sun, "down with day, and high time too. Why did we never think of it before?" As soon as the sun had said it, all the children of the light began to wonder why they hadn't thought of it before, and to consider how they might bring it about. "Leave that to me," said the sun. "Each must do his share, but all must be done together. I will myself concoct a plan for effective action, and as soon as it is prepared you shall know your parts. Hold yourselves ready for the 1st of April. Till then, the great thing to remember is that upon one point we are all agreed. Down with day. Down with day," shouted all things together. Birds, beasts and fishes, grass, flowers and trees, stones, wood and water. Down with day. They were all of them very determined, and none of them knew what about. As soon as the detectives had got their disguises, they scattered themselves over the city to find clues by which they might discover the king's daughter. Some looked in the broad streets, and some in the twisty ones. Some searched the parks, and some searched the slums. Wherever they went, they found suspicious signs, and as soon as they found them, they hurried with them straight to the palace to tell the king. Detective A, for instance, disguised himself as a park keeper, and in the very first hour discovered a ragged tramp snoring in the grass under a tree. "That's a suspicious character, that," thought Detective A. "It is written all over his face." To test his theory, he stooped down over the snorer and shouted in his ear, "Where's the king's daughter?" The tramp half opened one eye, muttered first to the right and second to the left, and began to snore again. Detective A ran as hard as he could on the trail, and the first to the right and the second to the left brought him to a public house called the Hog's Head. In the bar 19 sailors were being served by the thin innkeeper and his buxom wife. Detective A pushed his way to the front and ordered a pint of porter as a blind. The moment he had drunk it down, he threw off all pretenses, and seizing the innkeeper by one hand and his wife by the other, he demanded, "Where's the king's daughter?" "How should we know?" retorted the innkeeper. "Wherever she is, she's not here." "Ah, you'd deny it, would you?" cried Detective A. "Hands off, my lad," said the innkeeper's wife, pulling her wrist away. "Ah, you'd struggle, would you?" cried Detective A. Then he threw open his coat, revealed himself, and arrested them. And to make things safer, he also arrested the 19 sailors and ordered them to follow him to the palace. And on the way, to make things quite safe, he stopped in the park and arrested the tramp. Then he took them all to the king. "Who are these?" asked the king. These are doubtful characters, Your Majesty, said Detective A. This one, he pointed to the tramp, says your daughter is at these one's public house, and he pointed to the innkeeper and his wife. And these ones say that this one is mistaken, and he pointed to the tramp again. One of them is telling a story. Oh, what a pity, said the king. And who are all these? And he looked at the 19 sailors. These were all in the bar at the time, said the detective, and probably in the conspiracy too. I thought it best to take no chances. You did splendidly, said the king, and you shall be promoted. Let the suspected persons be thrown into prison, and if they have not proved themselves innocent by the 1st of April, they shall die. While this was being done, the king promoted Detective A, and he had scarcely finished doing so before Detective B came in disguised as a customer, and behind him came a draper, 43 shop girls, a nurse, and a baby in a pram. Who are these? Asked the king. These are suspicious persons, Your Majesty, said Detective B. I noticed this baby's pram standing for half an hour outside this draper's shop, and the baby was crying in a highly suspicious manner, but refused to inform me of what was wrong. So I went inside the shop, and there I saw the nurse being served at the counter with a yard of something. What's that? I says to her. Mind your own business, she says to me. It is my business, says I, and seized the object, which proved to be this. And Detective B produced from his pocket a yard of blue elastic. What's that for? Asked the king. Just what I asked her, Your Majesty. And she said I was no gentleman and refused to tell me. So as she wouldn't confess, of course I arrested her, and to be on the safe side, I also arrested everybody else in the shop, and the baby into the bargain. You did well, beamed the king. Unless they can prove their case, they shall all be beheaded on the 1st of April. And he had the nurse, the baby, the draper, and the 43 shop girls thrown into prison and began to promote Detective B. He was only half done when Detective C came in, disguised as a postman, followed by 402 private householders. Who are all these? Asked the king. These are all suspectable individuals, Your Majesty, said Detective C. They have all had letters sent to their houses with the wrong names and addresses on them, and to avert suspicion they have all written, not known, on the envelopes and put them back in the pillar box. So I gave each of them a double rat-tat, and as soon as they opened the door I arrested them, as you see, till they tell who the letters are for, and who they are from, and what is inside them. Wonderful, cried the king. If they have not told by the 1st of April, they shall perish. You too shall be promoted. Did ever a king have a detective force like mine? During the next hour, Detective D, disguised as a ticket collector, came in with 978 persons who had bought railway tickets and were obviously trying to leave the city, and Detective E, disguised as a public librarian, brought in 2,315 novel readers who had all asked for detective stories at the public library. There was no doubt of it that they were all suspicious characters, and they too were thrown into prison until they could explain themselves. Otherwise, said the king, on the 1st of April they would all lose their heads. So it went on till night, and just as the king was going up to bed, there was a great shout in the palace, and the sound of scurrying feet, and into the throne room dashed the housekeeper with an open penknife in her hand and a second housemaid at her heels. Gesticulating wildly, the housekeeper rushed towards the throne, but before she could reach it, the second housemaid tripped her up, gagged her, and handcuffed her. "Bless my soul," said the king. "What's all this about?" The second housemaid got up and took off her cap. Her hair came off with it, and in its place the rather bald head of the second detective was disclosed. He pointed, panting a little, to the speechless housekeeper struggling on the floor. "This is a highly suspicious person, Your Majesty," said he. "Disguised as one of Your Majesty's second housemaids, I went to search your daughter's room for clues. I stole in quietly when no one was looking and immediately saw that someone had been before me. The carpet was strewn with bits of metal. Every lock of the princess's drawers and cupboards had been picked. Certain that all was not well, I continued my investigations. I looked stealthily behind curtains and opened cupboard doors suddenly. At last I looked under the bed. There I saw a big black felt slipper, and in the slipper was a foot. Beside it was a second foot inside another slipper. I dragged them out into the light and found them attached to the body of Your Majesty's housekeeper. She fled. I gave chase, and the end of the chase you saw." "Yes, but," said the king, "she isn't my housekeeper." "Not," cried the second detective. "Worse and worse. She is probably a dangerous criminal who, having stolen your daughter, came back for loot. I think we can safely say, Your Majesty, that we are on the track." The king was delighted. The false housekeeper was condemned to death on the 1st of April. The second detective was promoted, and the court went to bed and to sleep. But nobody else did, for by now everybody knew that 1,000 detectives in disguise were let loose in the streets, and that at any moment you might be arrested by anybody. Before morning, half the people in the city were under lock and key, and the other half was running away as hard as it could from everybody else. Master Johnny Jenkinson, who was the drummer boy in the king's army, went beating his drum up the path to his mother's cottage door. Instead of knocking, he beat a special tattoo that brought his mother running. As soon as she set eyes on him, she threw up her hands for joy and then flung her arms round his neck, crying, "It's never you, Johnny. It never can be you," as though she couldn't believe her senses. "Yes, Ma, it's me," said Johnny. "What's for supper?" "Dad, Dad, come here," cried Mrs. John Jenkinson, and from the back garden appeared Mr. John Jenkinson with a spade, and seeing his son he sat down plump on the third stair and filled his pipe to hide his emotion. "But Johnny, what brings you here?" asked his mother, "when I thought you were 20 miles off in the city." "I've got a week's leave, Ma," said Johnny, "and so has every man-jack of us." "But for why, Johnny?" "Ah," said Johnny, looking important, "that's what we haven't been told. But we can guess. There's something big afoot." "War, do you mean?" whispered Mr. John Jenkinson. "What else can it be, Dad?" replied Johnny. "For what else could it be?" "War with whom, Johnny?" asked Mrs. John Jenkinson. "Well, it's being kept as dark, Ma," said Johnny. "But who's to stop a chap thinking? Some of us think it's war with the King of the North, and some think it's war with the King of the South. But my opinion is," he paused, because he hadn't made up his opinion yet. You don't mean to say, Johnny, gasped Mrs. John Jenkinson. You never mean to say it's war with both. Why don't I? Asked Johnny, closing one eye. And from that moment he did. This is awful, moaned Mrs. John Jenkinson. We can never beat them both at once, never. Trust us, Ma, boasted Johnny and did a tattoo on his drum. All we want is good victuals inside us, and then we can tackle anything. What's for supper? Mrs. John Jenkinson threw her apron over her head and wept aloud. Nothing's for supper, Johnny, nothing at all. The cook's given notice. But here, I say, cried Johnny, for the first time looking anxious. We haven't got a cook. You do the cooking in this house, Ma. Well, and if I do, retorted his mother, drying her eyes and looking rather defiant. What I say is, the one that does the cooking is the cook, and I suppose I can give notice as well as another. But why, Ma? Because it's the fashion, Johnny. The king's cook gave notice the day before yesterday, and every other cook in the country stopped cooking within 24 hours. It would be a sort of treason for us to go on cooking when the king's cook won't. And there it is. Johnny sat down by his father on the third stair. This spoils my leave, this does, he said. And what's more, it will spoil every other chap's leave too. You wouldn't believe what a chap's meals mean to a chap on leave. And not only to chaps on leave, said Mr. John Jenkinson, puffing his pipe to conceal his feelings. There's others. What do you do come dinner time, Dad? Asked Johnny. I goes down to the inn and smokes, said Mr. John Jenkinson. Let's get along, then, said Johnny. And father and son went sadly down the path. At the inn they found every man in the village assembled. It was the only place for the men to go now that the women had stopped cooking. Feeling against the women was beginning to run high. As the men got hungrier and hungrier, they also got angrier and angrier, and the women, on their part, got stubborner and stubborner. Nothing for breakfast? Nothing for dinner? Nothing for tea, cried the men at mealtimes. The king gets nothing for breakfast and dinner and tea, retorted the women. And what the king gets is good enough for you. So in all the inns all over the land the men gathered and talked furiously about the women, and they took a resolution that as long as the women wouldn't cook, they wouldn't work. United we stand, divided we fall, said Johnny's father. We'll all stop work together on the 1st of April. The word flew like wildfire from into and throughout the kingdom, and every man jack of them agreed. But it wasn't only women that were talked of in the inns, for now that the soldiers had come home on leave, they began to talk furiously about war as well. Like Johnny the drummer boy, each soldier came back looking very important, as though he alone knew what it all meant, and some said they were going to war with the king of the north, and others with the king of the south. Nay, said another, 'tis the king of the east. Wrong, said a fourth, 'tis the king of the west. Guess again, jeered a fifth, 'tis none of these at all, but the king of the blacks, and I had it from the lance corporal himself. Then the lance corporal may put his head in a bucket, scoffed a sixth, for the sergeant major told me, in strictest confidence, that 'twas the king of the whites. The arguments raged high, for this king and that. Every monarch in the world was named by one soldier or another. And the spies of the monarchs heard what was said, and hurried back to their own countries with the news, and as soon as they heard it, all the kings of the world gave orders for their armies to be mustered, and their ships to set sail on the 1st of April. On the first day of April, the king sipped his coffee and said, "This is the day for the suspicious characters to be beheaded." And the colonel in command buttered his toast and said, "This is the day for the boy who cleans the silver to be arrested." And all the men in the land said, "The day has come for us to stop work." And all the kings of the world said, "The day has come for us to go to war." And the sun called the children of the light and said, "The hour is come to do day down." And the moon summoned the children of the dark and said, "The hour is come to prove night in the wrong." And now, terrible things began to happen all over the world. First, the colonel in command called out the army to arrest the boy, and the army wouldn't come. So the colonel went to the army and flashed his sword at them and asked, "Why not?" Then up spoke Johnny the drummer boy. "Because, Colonel, a soldier's a man as well as a soldier, and today every man jack in the land has stopped work." Every man jack," shouted the army. The colonel clicked his spurs at them and asked, "What for?" "Because as long as the king's cook won't cook for him, the women won't cook for us, and no man can work on an empty stomach. As soon as the king's cook goes back and we've had a square meal, we'll do our jobs again." A good square meal," shouted the army. The colonel rattled his medals at them and went to tell the king that he must get back his cook at any price. The cook was sent for, looked at the kitchen grate, said the chimney was still dripping and the kitchen fire wouldn't light, and refused to come back till it did. Then the king said, "Send for the plumber." And the plumber sent back word that a plumber might be a plumber, but he was likewise a man, and every man jack had stopped work, and until his wife began cooking again, he wasn't going to plumb for anybody. Then the king sent for the second detective, because the chief detective had entirely disappeared. No one knew where. When the second detective came, the king commanded him to arrest the cook for not cooking, and the plumber for not plumbing, and the second detective scratched his chin and said, "I'm sorry, I can't." "Why can't you?" asked the king. "It's like this, Your Majesty. A detective may be a detective, but he is also a man, and until my wife begins cooking again, I can't go on detecting." "But what about all the people who were to be beheaded today?" cried the king. "They'll have to keep their heads," said the detective, "because the headsman says it's all very well, but a headsman's a man, isn't he?" And until his wife begins cooking again, the king put his fingers in his ears and burst into tears. But the next moment he took them out again and said, "What's that?" And no wonder, for the sound of cannons and trumpets was ringing through the air, and the nurse rushed in to say that all the monarchs of the world were marching on the city, and the coast was entirely surrounded with their ships. "Help! Help! Call out the army!" cried the king. But the colonel shrugged his epaulets at him and said, "They won't." "Then we are lost," groaned the king, "and nothing can save us." Even as he said it, the sun went out, and the larks flew down instead of up, and the daisies turned black, and the dogs mewed like cats, and the stars came down and walked upon the earth, and a mouse came and pushed the king off his throne, and a seagull came and sat on his footstool. And the clock struck midnight at noon, and dawn broke in the west, and the wind blew the other way, and the sea ran backwards at high tide, and the cocks crowed for the moon to rise, and the moon rose inside out, showing her black lining, and day fell down flat, and night was all wrong. And in the midst of all the confusion, the door opened, and the king's daughter came in her nightdress. The king flew at her and caught her to his heart, crying, my child, where have you been?" "I've been sitting on the chimney pot, Daddy," said the king's daughter. "Why did you sit on the chimney pot, my darling?" "Because I wanted the moon," said the king's daughter. The nurse took her by the shoulders, shook her severely, and said, "You've got your nightdress damp, you naughty little girl." "That was where I cried on it," said the king's daughter. "I cried all day and all night, and I never stopped once. I cried all down me, and all down the chimney." "Did you indeed?" exclaimed the cook, and she rushed to the kitchen. The chimney had stopped dripping, so she lighted the fire and began to cook as hard as she could. At the same moment, the mouse and the seagull went hurrying to the children of the dark and of the light, crying together, "The king's daughter has brown hair, brown eyes, and a brown skin." The children of the dark turned in a body upon the bat and shouted, "You told us she had black hair, gray eyes, and a white skin." "I suppose I got mixed in the dark," muttered the bat. "And you told us that she had gold hair, blue eyes, and a rosy skin," shouted the children of the light to the swallow. "I must have got dazzled by the dawn," twittered she. The children of both light and dark then said, "This puts us in a difficult position. We have been supporting a creature who is not one of us. We must set day on his feet again at once, and tell night that she is entirely in the right." No sooner said than done. The stars went back to their places, the sea reversed itself, time straightened itself out, and everything did what it ought to do. And when, last of all, the sun came out, he shone upon the kings of the world sailing home in their ships as fast as they could. For they said they had never seen anything like it, and you couldn't go to war with everything as topsy-turvy as that, could you? The good news was brought to the king in the palace, and he clapped his hands and said to the colonel in command, "Now they've gone, we shan't want the army for them, so let it arrest the boy who cleans the silver." "What for, your majesty?" "For stealing the princess." "But he didn't steal me," said the princess. "Oh, so he didn't," said the king. "Then we must let him off. And I suppose we must let off all the people who were going to be beheaded too." "All but the false housekeeper I found in the princess's bedroom," said the second detective, "for she was a suspicious character." So he went and let out the tramp and the sailors and the nurse and the baby and the draper and the shop girls and the householders and the train travelers and the novel readers and all the others who had been put in prison. But the false housekeeper he dragged by the hair into the king's presence, and just as he got her there the hair came off, and the quite bald head of the chief detective appeared in its place. So they took the handcuffs off his hands and the gag out of his mouth, and when he had done spluttering he said to the king, "Wasn't my disguise a good one? Nobody recognized me, not even my second detective." "You shall be promoted," said the king. "But what were you doing in the princess's bedroom?" "I was searching for clues, of course, and I'd only just done picking the locks with my penknife when I heard someone coming. That was me," said this second detective. "So naturally I got under the bed. And I found you there, boasted the second detective. Ah, but I found something else there, said the chief detective. This. And from under his big black skirts he produced a silver plate. There, cried the nurse. That's the very one that was missing, and if it hadn't been missing, I'd never have suspected the boy of stealing the princess. So it was your fault, every bit of it, she said, turning to the princess. What did you take it for, you naughty little girl? Because it was so nice and round and bright, said the princess, and I wanted it. And I do want it. You shall keep it, said the king, as long as you promise me one thing. Yes, I promise. What is it? Asked the princess. Never to cry for the moon any more. I should just think I wouldn't, said the little princess. The moon is horrid. I've seen her inside. It's all black. That's why I came down. What's for dinner? And what's for dinner? They were asking all over the country, and the women stirred the pots, and the men went back to work, and the sun rose in the east and set in the west. And the world forgot in less than no time everything that comes about when the king's daughter cries for the moon.